I used to think I was being paranoid. That's what 3 years with Derek Whitfield had trained me to believe. Every time something felt wrong, I searched for the version of the story where I was the problem, because that version was always waiting for me, pre-written, ready to hand over. Reagan had a way of making herself the center of gravity in any room. She'd walk into a bar wearing one of Derek's old hoodies. Not a hoodie like his actual hoodie, the gray one with the frayed cuff, and drape herself across the back of his chair like she was staking a claim she didn't need to make out loud. "I'm basically one of the guys," she loved to say, usually right after doing something one of the guys would ever do. Sitting in a lap, feeding someone a fry off her own fork, calling Derek at 2 in the morning because she'd had a nightmare or a bad date or nothing at all, just needed to hear his voice, apparently, at an hour when mine was the only voice that should have mattered. I brought it up exactly 4 times over 3 years. Each time, Derek's face did the same practiced thing, a little furrow, a little sigh, like I was the exhausting one. That's just how she is. She's like a sister to me. You know I'd never choose her over you. I believed him. That's the part that still embarrasses me. Not that he lied, people lie, but that I built an entire architecture of patience around a man who never once had to build anything for me. The night everything actually broke was unremarkable right up until it wasn't. I'd had a work dinner run long, texted him twice with no response, and let myself into his penthouse a little after 11, expecting an empty apartment and a note about takeout containers in the fridge. Instead, I found them on the couch. The television throwing blue light across both of them, some movie neither of them was watching, and Derek's arm slung over Reagan's shoulders the exact way it used to rest over mine. She was wearing the sweatshirt I'd bought him for his birthday, the navy one with his initials stitched into the cuff, a gift I'd spent 2 weeks deciding on. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I just stood in the doorway with my keys still in my hand until Derek startled awake and blinked at me like I was the one who'd done something wrong. "It's not what it looks like," he said, sitting up too fast. Reagan didn't even bother sitting up. She rolled her eyes at the ceiling, stretched like a cat, and said, "We fell asleep watching a movie, Claire. Grow up." Grow up. As if the problem in that room was my age and not her hands on my boyfriend's chest when she pushed herself upright. Derek actually reached for me, actually expected. I could see it forming behind his eyes in real time that I would apologize. That I would be the one smoothing things over by morning, the way I always was, because that was my role in this particular play, and I'd never once missed a cue. I didn't say anything else. I set my keys on the counter, unhooked the apartment key from my ring, and placed it beside them. Then I slid the promise ring off my finger, the one he'd given me 8 months earlier with a speech about forever that I could still recite verbatim, and set it on top of the key. "Claire." His voice cracked on my name in a way that, 6 months earlier, would have undone me completely. I was already in the elevator when I blocked his number. I watched the little red icon appear next to his name and felt something in my chest unclench for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit. Behind the closing doors, I heard Reagan's voice, light and unbothered, already turning this into a story she'd tell later. She's being so dramatic. The doors shut. I rode down 22 floors alone, and somewhere around floor 12, I started laughing, not because anything was funny, but because I finally understood that I'd spent 3 years defending my own reality against 2 people who had never once respected it. Derek's family didn't do quiet breakups. They did narratives. Within a week, the story circulating through the group chats and country club lunches wasn't Derek got caught with another woman on his couch. It was Claire had a jealous meltdown over nothing and humiliated everyone at dinner the following Sunday by not showing up. I know this because Marisol texted me a screenshot with the caption, "Are you seeing this?" I was. I'd been seeing versions of this story reshape itself in real time for 3 years. I just hadn't realized, until I was standing outside it, how completely Derek controlled the room. I moved back into my own apartment, the one I'd kept renting out of some instinct I hadn't examined closely enough to call foresight. My mother called it foresight anyway. "You always knew," she said, which wasn't true, but I let her have it because it was kinder than the truth, which was that I'd known and ignored it for 3 years because leaving felt harder than staying small. The Whitfield family was not a family you exited quietly, even when you weren't marrying into it yet. Derek's mother had already started referring to me at events as Derek's friend Claire within days, the demotion so smooth I almost admired the craftsmanship. There was exactly one person in that family who never did the demotion dance, and that was Weston. Derek's older half-brother, 7 years his senior, was the kind of quiet that made rooms rearrange themselves around him without anyone quite noticing it happening. Their mother had remarried after Weston's father died, when Weston was young, and Weston had grown up the quiet one from her first marriage in a house that clearly favored the golden son from her second. I'd actually met him before I ever met Derek, at a mutual friend's engagement party 8 years earlier, a single conversation I barely remembered until Derek introduced us again as a couple and Weston's face did something complicated for half a second before he shook my hand like a stranger's. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. I remembered him mostly, in the years since, for being the only person at that family's table who asked me a question about myself and then actually listened to the answer. Over the years, Weston had never once excused Reagan. I remembered a Christmas, maybe 4 years back, when she'd made a scene about being seated too far from Derek and Weston had simply said, without raising his voice, "You're seated exactly where a guest is seated," and gone back to his conversation. I remembered him watching Derek let it slide, watching me swallow my own discomfort and saying nothing, but his jaw had done a thing, a small tightening, that I filed away without understanding why. He texted me 4 days after I left. Not a call. Weston never called when a call could be mistaken for pressure. Heard the story making the rounds. It's wrong. I know it's wrong. If you need anything, you have my number now. I stared at that message for longer than I want to admit. Not because it was romantic. It wasn't. Not on its surface. But because it was the first time in 3 years that anyone connected to that family had simply told me the truth without asking me to manage their comfort about it first. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't ready to be anyone's next chapter. I was still finishing the last one, sitting alone in an apartment that smelled like paint because I'd spent the weekend redoing the walls Derek used to complain were too much personality, just to prove to myself I still had some. But I saved the number. The invitation came from the Whitfield Foundation, not from Derek, and not, I checked twice, from Reagan. A gala for the pediatric wing Weston's mother had endowed, the kind of event where I'd have been an afterthought on someone else's arm a month earlier. Now my name was on the list under my own. I almost didn't go. Then I thought about the version of the story circulating through that family's group chats and decided I was done being written about in absentia. I wore green, not for anyone, for myself, because it was the color Derek had once told me washed me out, and I'd quietly stopped wearing it for 3 years without noticing I'd let his opinion edit my closet. Derek saw me before I saw him. I felt it the way you feel weather changing, a pressure shift across the room. Reagan was on his arm in a dress that cost more than my rent, already telling someone a story with her hands, already the center of her own gravity. I didn't look for Weston. He found me, the way he always seemed to, not dramatically, just suddenly present at my elbow with 2 glasses of something dark gold. "You came," he said. I wasn't going to let a story. I didn't write be the only one on record. Something in his face shifted, approval, maybe, or recognition. We ended up at a table near the back, away from the stage, close enough to watch the room without being watched by it. He asked about my work, and this time I noticed what I'd never quite let myself notice before. He remembered details from a conversation we'd had 2 years earlier. The name of my old boss. The project I'd been nervous about. He'd been listening the entire time I thought no one in that family was. "Can I say something you're not going to like?" he asked, halfway through the second course. "You're going to say it either way. I've waited 8 years for you to realize your standards were too low." I set my fork down. "Excuse me." "You heard me. You chose now to say that, a week after I left him." "I chose now," he said, entirely unbothered. Because you're finally single, and I'm not in the business of telling a woman her relationship is beneath her while she's still in it. That's not honesty. That's just cruelty with better timing. Across the ballroom, I caught Derek mid-sentence, mid-toast, his champagne glass tipping dangerously as his eyes found our table. Beside him, Reagan's smile had gone flat and calculating, the performance dropping half a second before she caught herself. I looked back at Weston. You're serious? I've been serious since the second Christmas I watched him let her humiliate you and do nothing about it, he said. I just don't say things I'm not prepared to mean. For the first time in 3 years, someone had told me exactly what he thought without asking me to make it easier for him first. That's a lot to say over dessert, I told him. I've had 8 years to work on my timing. Reagan found me in the powder room 20 minutes later, which told me everything about how fast the news had traveled the length of that ballroom. Cute, she said, checking her lipstick in the mirror beside mine instead of looking at me directly. Going after the brother, real subtle, Claire. I didn't go after anyone. Weston doesn't do this. She said it like a fact she was reciting for her own comfort, not mine. He's never brought a date to a single family event in 10 years, and now suddenly you're at his table. Maybe he just didn't want to bring someone who wasn't worth bringing. Her eyes cut to mine in the mirror, and for the first time in the years I'd known her, I saw something under the performance, not hurt exactly, but the particular panic of someone realizing the ground she'd built her whole identity on was shifting without her permission. You know what your problem always was, she said. You never understood how these families work. Derek's mother loves me. His father loves me. I've been at every holiday for a decade. You were always just, she waved a hand, temporary. And yet somehow, I said, capping my lipstick, you're the one standing in a bathroom explaining yourself to someone who's supposedly temporary. I left her there. It wasn't a dramatic exit. I didn't need one. The satisfaction wasn't in the last word. It was in realizing, walking back into the ballroom, that I no longer felt the specific dread that used to accompany any interaction with her. That dread had belonged to a version of me who needed Derek's family to approve of her. That woman had left an apartment key and a promise ring on a kitchen counter a week ago. Weston was waiting near the terrace doors, not obviously, just positioned in a way that suggested he'd been keeping half an eye on the powder room hallway the entire time. She cornered you, he said, not a question. I handled it. I know you did. I still would have come in if you'd taken longer. Derek intercepted us before we reached the terrace, flushed, too loud, the particular anger of a man who'd spent a week being told a story where he was blameless and had just watched it collapse in real time. What exactly is this? He demanded, looking between us. This, Weston said, with the calm of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise his voice to be heard, is none of your business. You gave up any claim to an opinion on Claire's life a week ago, on your couch, if I remember the story correctly. Derek's jaw worked. Behind him, I saw his mother watching from across the room, her expression unreadable, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that the family narrative Derek had spent a week constructing was about to require serious revision. You've got nothing to say to me, Derek said to me directly, like the last week hadn't happened, like I still owed him a reaction. I already said everything I needed to, I told him. I left the key on the counter. Derek didn't take the terrace conversation as an ending. He took it as a setback, which was somehow worse, because setbacks were things he'd always known how to work around. The first email came 4 days later, sent to my work address because he knew I couldn't block that one without explaining to HR why my ex-boyfriend was suddenly a filtered sender. It was 3 paragraphs of I think we owe it to 3 years to talk like adults, which was rich, coming from the man who'd needed his own brother to explain to him what those 3 years had actually looked like. I didn't answer. He sent another 9 days after that, shorter, colder, accusing me of letting Weston poison my perspective, as if I hadn't personally watched Reagan wear his sweatshirt on his couch with my own eyes, no poisoning required. Then he started showing up, Not dramatically, Derek didn't do dramatic, he did coincidental. My gym, the one I'd been going to for 4 years before he ever knew it existed. The coffee shop 2 blocks from my office. Once, unmistakably, the lobby of my own building, where he told the doorman he was just passing through, and stood there long enough that the doorman mentioned it to me, concerned, the next morning. I told Weston about the lobby before I told anyone else, mostly because I didn't want him hearing it secondhand, and doing something about it before I'd decided how I wanted to handle it myself. "Do you want me to talk to him?" Weston asked. "Or do you want me to leave it alone?" It wasn't a loaded question. That was the thing I kept noticing about him. He asked instead of assuming, even when assuming would have been faster, even when I could see it cost him something to sit on his hands. "Leave it alone," I said. "For now. If it happens again, I'm handling it with a building manager, not a brother." "Fair," he said, and didn't bring it up again until I did. It happened again, 11 days later in the coffee shop, where Derek slid into the seat across from me like he'd been invited and told me he'd been doing a lot of thinking about what he'd gotten wrong. I let him finish the sentence. Then I told him calmly that if he approached me outside a professional context again, I'd be filing something with building security and mentioning it to his mother directly, since apparently that was the only audience he still cared about impressing. He didn't come back after that. Whatever Weston or his mother said behind closed doors, or whatever finally landed, the lobby coincidences stopped, the emails stopped, and the silence that followed felt less like victory and more like exhaling after holding my breath for 3 years without noticing I'd been doing it. Through all of it, Weston and I moved at a pace that felt almost stubbornly unhurried, which I came to understand was deliberate. He never once suggested I owed him gratitude for standing where Derek hadn't. He never brought up the dinner table confession again like it was a debt I needed to start repaying. We spent most evenings just talking, actual talking, not the performance of it I'd gotten used to with Derek, where conversations were staged for whoever might overhear them at a dinner table. Weston asked about my mother, remembered she'd had a knee surgery, asked how her recovery was going 3 weeks after I'd mentioned it in passing. He told me about growing up the older half-brother in a family that had clearly favored the younger, golden one, and how he'd spent most of his 20s deciding he'd rather be respected by the few people who mattered than liked by everyone who didn't. "I'm not in a hurry," he told me one night on his balcony when I asked, half joking, half testing, whether 8 years of waiting meant he expected things to move quickly now that I was actually available. "I waited 8 years for the right time. I can wait a little longer for the right pace." That's a very patient thing to say for a man who announced his feelings over dessert. "I said it at dinner because it was true and I was done sitting on it," he said. "That's different from rushing what comes after. I'd rather have you slowly and completely than fast and half-sure." It was the first time in longer than I could remember that someone's patience felt like respect instead of a performance of it. I didn't say yes to anything that night. I didn't need to. We just sat there, the city loud and indifferent below us, and for the first time since the couch, since the key on the counter, I let myself want something without immediately bracing for the cost of it. The fallout took about 3 weeks to fully surface, and I learned most of it secondhand, which felt appropriate given how much of my relationship with Derek had been conducted the same way. Weston's mother, the Foundation Gala's actual host, the woman whose approval Reagan had spent a decade cultivating, asked Reagan directly. At a family lunch I wasn't at but heard about from 3 separate sources, why she'd been photographed at the gala in a dress that cost more than most of the auction items she'd been fundraising to support, and why she'd been the subject of a very pointed conversation between her 2 sons. Weston, it turned out, hadn't just told me the truth about 8 years of watching. He'd apparently been documenting it in the quiet way people do when they've decided a pattern needs a paper trail eventually. The Christmas comment, 2 separate incidents at family events where Reagan had cornered girlfriends before me, a birthday party where she'd shown up in Derek's shirt uninvited to a couples-only dinner. Nothing dramatic. Just consistent, and now, finally, spoken aloud to the one person in the family whose opinion Reagan had always needed most. Derek's mother didn't cut Reagan off completely, Some habits of a decade don't unravel in a month, but the invitations changed. Fewer, further apart. The specific chill of a woman quietly rearranging her guest list without ever admitting she was doing it. Derek called me twice from a number I didn't recognize, which I only knew because I still hadn't unblocked the original one and voicemail transcription told on him anyway. Both messages were versions of the same appeal, that I'd blindsided him, that Weston had always had a thing for me, that this was somehow a scheme I'd been running instead of a truth he'd refused to see for 3 years. I didn't call back, not out of cruelty. I simply didn't have anything left to explain to a man who'd needed a month and his own brother's plane speaking to understand something I'd told him outright 4 separate times. Weston and I didn't rush anything, which surprised me more than the 8-year confession had. He took me to dinner twice a week for a month before he ever tried to hold my hand, and even then he asked, quietly, almost formally, like it mattered to him that I have the space to say no without it costing me anything. You don't have to do the thing where you check in on everything, I told him, halfway through the 2nd month, sitting on his balcony with a glass of wine I wasn't rushing to finish. I know I don't have to, he said. I want to. There's a difference between the two, and I don't think anyone ever showed you that difference before. He was right, and it took me longer than I wanted to admit to stop flinching slightly every time he asked what I wanted instead of assuming he already knew. 6 months after the gala, the Whitfield Foundation held its spring benefit, and I walked in on Weston's arm without a single flicker of the dread that used to precede any room that family occupied. Derek was there, alone this time. Reagan wasn't, I heard from Marisol, that the invitations had quietly stopped coming for her sometime around February, and that she'd been telling a new story about outgrowing that whole scene to anyone who'd still listen. I didn't feel triumphant about it, which surprised me. I'd expected to. I'd spent 3 years imagining what vindication might feel like, and it turned out to feel like almost nothing. A small, quiet absence where dread used to live, freed up space I was slowly learning to fill with better things. Weston's mother found me near the dessert table, which felt significant given that 6 months earlier I'd been Derek's friend Claire, to her and nothing more. I owe you an apology, she said, without preamble, in the direct way I was starting to recognize as a family trait. I watched that girl operate in my house for 10 years and told myself it wasn't my place to say anything. It cost you 3 years you didn't deserve to lose. You don't owe me anything, I said and meant it, but thank you. Weston tells me he waited 8 years, she said, watching my face carefully. I always wondered why he never brought anyone around. Now I know. Across the room, Derek caught my eye for half a second, not angry anymore, just tired, the particular tiredness of a man still constructing a version of events where he'd been the one wronged. I didn't feel the need to correct him. Some people only learn the truth when the room stops agreeing to lie for them, and that wasn't my job to arrange anymore. Weston found me exactly where he always seemed to, materializing at my elbow with 2 glasses of something dark gold, an echo of the first night that had started all of this. Regretting the dress color yet? He asked, nodding at the green silk I hadn't stopped wearing since that gala. Never again, I said. Turns out it was never actually wrong for me. Someone just wanted me to think it was. For what it's worth, he said. I've thought you looked good in it since the first time I saw you wear it. I just didn't have the right to say so back then. And now? Now, he said, I've got 8 years of things I didn't say and no reason left to keep waiting. I let him take my hand this time without checking first whether it was safe to want something for myself. Across the ballroom, the story about me had finally, completely, stopped being anyone else's to tell. Thank you so much for listening to Dusklit Audio. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the story. Leave a heart or thumbs up in the comments if you want more.